Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frost Over the World from Washington. Later in the programme I'll be talking with Hollywood megastar Robert De Niro in a very rare interview, and former Democratic presidential candidate John Kerry, just back from the Middle East. But first, America's so-called backyard, Central America. 30 years ago, Nicaragua's Somoza dictatorship was overthrown, and Sandinista leader Daniel Ortega went on to become president. The left-leaning government was disliked, to put it mildly, here in Washington, and President Ronald Reagan and the early neocons did all that they could to help the insurgency. The insurgents, of course, called the Contras, fighting against the Sandinistas. In the end, it was the voters who finally, rather than the rebels, ousted Ortega in 1990. But 2 years ago, 20 years later, he's back, re-elected on a slim 37% of the vote. But the new Ortega administration has not been without its critics, some of them former allies, who accuse President Ortega of wanting to turn the country back into a dictatorship again. Well, earlier this week, I flew to Managua to meet with President Daniel Ortega. How old were you when you first thought that politics and revolution might be your life? How young were you then?
The truth, I was still a boy, about 7 or 8 years old, when I first would hear my father talking about his experiences. He had fought with Sandino, and as a boy I heard my mother tell of her experiences of being jailed by the Somozas, and I would hear about my father's experiences of being jailed by the Somozas. So I got interested in politics quite young.
As the time approached for the revolution, in addition to speaking and all of that, was it also a case that you had to fight as well? Did you get that sort of training in Cuba? I mean, was it kill or be killed as well as speaking and so on, and giving speeches?
Yes. In 1978, I was in charge of a guerrilla unit in the insurrection in northern Nicaragua, and so we were fighting against the National Guard. And in combat, you are not sure. You are shooting, they are shooting, the bullets are all around you, and so you are not really sure if you are killing this enemy or the other. But we were two enemies firing at each other, and at the end of the combat, we found a number of the guardsmen who had been killed, and one of their officers had been killed. One of our members had been wounded, so I cannot say how many men I killed, but yes, I was in a situation where you had to kill or be killed. That was a situation of great tension, but I had had other experiences as well. For example, there was Somoza's worst henchman. He was a specialist in torture. He had tortured me, and he had tortured many other persons. The Frente Sandinista de Liberación Nacional had decided to execute him, so there was an operation in which I participated when we went in with submachine guns, and we went after him, and he tried to fight, but there were many more of us, and we managed to kill him.
And throughout the period of the 80s, I mean, you and the Sandinistas and so on were headlines all over the world. When you lost the election to Mrs. Chamorro in 1990. That must have come as even more of a shock to you than it did to the world. The real shock.
Yo pienso que la pérdida electoral.
I think the electoral loss was inevitable. At the time, Nicaragua had 3.5 million inhabitants and had just gone through a contra-war where there had been more than 35,000 casualties. Every day, kids were being buried who had died in the war. The economic situation was very difficult, and our social programs were the targets of the Contras. They would go after the teachers. They would go after the healthcare centers. They would go after the road projects and the doctors, so that there was a wearing down of the population. So that election was more like a plebiscite, war versus peace. And we also have to remember that the opposition candidate had the backing of George Bush Sr. The message from the United States was, if you want peace, if you want help from the United States, you vote for Mrs. Chamorro. So the results of that election were unexpected. We wanted to win, we expected to win, and it was very hard to assimilate the results and for them to really sink in. But we didn't think twice about accepting the results.
In terms of this period of office, this period of power, you have had more critics, really, than you had last time. And some of them complain, I mean, when you had those 60 intellectuals after you had your fight with Mr. Cardinal, and they said, these 60 intellectuals protested the lack of transparency, the authoritarian style, unscrupulous behavior, lack of ethics that he'd shown, that you had shown since you came back to power again, and complaining about the corruption of the results in last November's municipal elections and so on. That criticism, does that go to the heart, or do you think it's just not relevant?
I understand it perfectly. I understand it as part of a crisis that was caused, above all, by intellectuals after the fall of Eastern Europe. When Eastern Europe fell, intellectuals in Latin America and elsewhere began to get restless. They began to complain. These same intellectuals who had been identified with the socialist revolution, with the socialist camp, with Moscow, who were honored to have been in Moscow and to have been honored by Moscow. When the socialist revolution leaves government, then comes the criticism. Then they become critical of the revolution.
And your friend Hugo Chavez has just won a vote that he can stand for office as president for as long as he wants and as often as he wants. Would you like to, or are you going to indeed, change the law here so that you could run again in the next election and not have to wait for 5 years before you can run again? Would you like to change the law here?
En la Constitución del 87 no había ninguna limitación.
In the Constitution of 1987, there was no limitation in terms of successive candidacies.
En El año 1995 con el gobierno
It was in 1995
se reformó la
that the
Constitución
Constitution
y ahí
was actually amended under a right-wing government to prevent that.
quitarle al pueblo el
It was
derecho
partially to prevent the people from being able to
elegir
exercise their right to elect
y ahí se estableció ya
authorities as they felt was fit, that electoral change.
nosotros
Since
venimos planteando
1996, we
desde
have
hace
felt
ya
there is a need
varios
in
años,
Nicaragua to change this again
campañas electorales
in order to
del
implement
96, del
what we
2000,
call
veníamos planteando
direct
la necesidad
democracy,
de que en Nicaragua
which means
pasemos
that the citizens of
a
our
un
country
régimen
are permitted to exercise direct
democracia
democracy.
Es decir, abrir espacios de
And we
participación
have felt
ciudadana
strongly
en el ejercicio del poder.
that we need to
Y que
change
esto lleva así,
our presidential system
como una necesidad,
to a parliamentary
acabar con el
system
sistema presidencialista
that would
y
then
establecer
not
un
have
régimen
these
parlamentario.
constraints
En
for
un régimen
successive
parlamentario
elections.
no hay inhibición para que se pueda estar dando la reelección de autoridades.
And obviously, you're going to be battling for your campaign for the rest of your life. I wasn't quite clear from what you said earlier. Would you like to have another term immediately at the end of this term? Would you, or would you like to do a Putin, and for five years you could be prime minister and someone else could be president? Would you like to do a Putin?
Yo comparto el principio.
I support the principle that the people have a right to elect a candidate,
El derecho a elegir o a no elegir.
or not. If the candidate is in their interest, they will elect him. And if the candidate does not represent their wishes, they will not elect him. I think that's what was at stake in the recent referendum in Venezuela, the referendum that Hugo Chavez had in Venezuela. And I support completely that position that the people should have the right to elect the candidate of their choice. And these obstacles should not be set up to deny them that right. Now that we're back in government, if conditions permit, yes, I would run again for president. And if those conditions were not present, I would be fine exercising as prime minister and then once again running for president.
You said that if God gives you health and so on, that you'll go on doing these things and so on. I keep reading in the papers here and so on, people saying that you're very ill with leukemia or something, but you look extremely well this evening, and you're as vigorous now as when we started. I assume that those rumours are wrong, and that you're going to live to be 100 years old.
Bueno, mi madre vivió
Well,
97
my
años.
mother lived to be 97 years old, and I just hope I will be able to live long enough to contribute to this new stage of development of the revolution. This is a very exciting time, you know. These are very exciting times, but a psychological war is being waged against us. For example, Ernesto Cardenal has stated that I can't take or be in the sun,
Decía que yo padezco de una enfermedad
and that I have this condition that prevents me from being exposed to sunlight, and that is why my wife, Rosario, plays such a significant role.
en la compañera Rosario. ¿Ve?
It's just part of the psychological war to create this image in people's minds.
Que están nada más en la cabeza de quienes están interesados en hacer daño.
Mr. President, thank you very much indeed.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Gracias. Thank you. Gracias.
Our thanks to President Daniel Ortega. Former US presidential candidate John Kerry joins me here in the studio after this short break.